Right now, inside your bloodstream, your body is playing this really high-stakes game of molecular tug-of-war.
Yeah, and if one side pulls too hard, I mean, you bleed out from a minor scratch.
Exactly. But if the other side pulls too hard, your blood essentially turns to cement. It just cuts off oxygen to your vital organs in, like, a matter of minutes.
It's just terrifying.
Right. It really is. So today, we are looking at the stack of pharmacology and hematology sources you sent us. We want to understand the biochemical explosives that doctors use when that system completely fails. We are talking about thrombolytics, which you probably know better as clot-busters.
Yeah, and to really grasp the stakes here, you have to realize that when a clot blocks a major artery, say in the brain or the heart, the tissue downstream doesn't just die instantly.
Right, it's not like flipping a switch.
Exactly. It enters this state of extreme distress. Hematologists actually call the area surrounding the core of a stroke the ischemic penumbra.
It's the ischemic penumbra, so that's the tissue that's basically starving.
Yes, it's functioning on absolute fumes, but, and this is the key, it is technically still salvageable. You know, if blood flow can be restored in time.
But for decades, doctors couldn't really do that, right? They just had to stand by and offer supportive care while that penumbra slowly died off.
Right, they had no way to clear the pipes. So the mission of this deep dive is to explore the drugs that change that reality. We want to look at how they actively dissolve those blockages, but also the really severe risks they carry and why the medical community is actually rethinking their primary role today.
Okay, let's unpack this because right out of the gate, looking at your sources, there is this fundamental misconception about blood thinners that we really need to clear up.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because when most people hear about clot drugs, they think about prevention.
But thrombolytics do not prevent clots.
No, they don't. Preventing a new clot from forming, or even stopping a small one from getting bigger, that is the job of anticoagulants. Things like heparin or warfarin or antiplatelet drugs like aspirin.
Right, those just kind of keep the blood slippery, so to speak. Basically, yeah. They alter the blood's chemistry to keep it flowing smoothly. Thrombolytics serve an entirely different function. They are only deployed after a catastrophic blockage has already occurred.
So they are not a preventative measure at all.
Not at all. Their sole pharmacological purpose is to actively break down a clot that is already anchored in place.
And to understand how they accomplish that, we have to look at the actual mechanics of blood coagulation. Because a clot isn't just a static plug that forms and sits there.
Right, it's not just a cork in a bottle.
Exactly. The sources describe it as this continuous dynamic equilibrium. Your body is basically constantly running two opposing systems.
Yeah.
You have coagulation, which builds clots, and fibrinolysis, which breaks them down.
Yeah, the baseline state of your circulatory system is just this constant churn. Microscopic clots are forming and dissolving all the time, but when a massive, life-threatening clot forms, it relies on a specific protein called fibrin.
Fibrin. Okay, so if a clot is a brick wall, the platelets and red blood cells are the bricks, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to picture it. And the fibrin is the biological mortar. It's holding all those cellular bricks tightly together in this complex, cross-linked mesh.
So if a thrombolytic drug is going to reopen that artery, it doesn't just smash into the wall like a wrecking ball. The texts point out that these drugs actually hijack the body's own native demolition crew.
The mechanism is highly elegant, honestly, because circulating in your blood right now is this inactive protein called plasminogen. It just, floats around waiting for a signal.
Just waiting to be activated.
Exactly. And thrombolytic drugs act as a chemical catalyst. They force a structural change in that circulating plasminogen, converting it into its active form, an enzyme called plasmin.
And plasmin acts like a pair of molecular scissors, right?
Yes. It acts as a highly specialized protease. So plasmin specifically seeks out the chemical bonds in that fibrin mortar and literally snips them apart. Yeah, it unweaves the net holding the clot together. As that fibrin mesh degrades, the platelets and red blood cells lose their anchor, the whole structure collapses, and the blood vessel reopens. We call that process reperfusion.
Which actually brings up this really funny turf war in the sources over what to even call this drug class.
Oh, the terminology debate.
Yeah, because pharmacology courses tend to use thrombolytic and fibrinolytic interchangeably. But the rigorous hematology texts, they argue that fibrinolytic is the only accurate term.
Well, the hematologists are just being mechanistically precise.
Because they're scientists.
Right, they love precision. The rhombolysis implies the dissolution of the entire thrombus, the whole clot, which has all those different cellular components, but these drugs don't target red blood cells or platelets.
Right, they just need the mortar.
Exactly. They specifically and exclusively target the fibrin mesh. Therefore, they are fibrinolytics.
It seems like a pedantic debate, calling someone a mortar-dissolving specialist instead of a building destroyer. But I get why precision matters when you were dealing with biochemistry.
Definitely.
But wait, if these drugs work by hijacking a complex human enzyme system, where did we first find a chemical capable of triggering that reaction?
This is wild. The origin story actually takes us far outside human biology. In 1933 at NYU, two researchers named William Tillett and R. Garner were studying cultures of streptococcus bacteria.
Yeah.
They were trying to understand how this specific bacteria caused such severe infections. And during their experiments, they noticed that a liquid filtrate extracted from the bacterial cultures had this weird ability to rapidly liquefy clotted human blood plasma.
Wait, so the original clot-busting drug was literally a bacterial weapon?
Yes. They had isolated what we now call streptokinase. The streptococcus bacterium secretes this molecule as a virulence factor. It's an evolutionary adaptation.
How does that even work?
Well, when a human is infected, the immune system often tries to quarantine the invading bacteria by building a localized fibrin wall around it.
Oh, to trap it in one place.
Exactly. So the bacteria release streptokinase to hijack the host's plasminogen, turning it into plasmin, which then just melts the quarantine wall so the infection can spread deeper into the tissues.
That is an incredible evolutionary arms race.
Mm.
I mean, our body builds a wall to trap the bacteria, and the bacteria deploy a chemical to turn our own biological scissors against the wall.
It's brilliant in a terrifying way. And for decades, streptokinase was viewed simply as a fascinating laboratory phenomenon. Its clinical potential wasn't really realized until the 1950s.
Enter Saul Sherry, right?
Yep, a physician researcher named Saul Sherry, he began purifying it and administering it to patients suffering from deep vein thrombosis and acute heart attacks. He basically founded the field of clinical thrombolysis using this bacterial protein.
And this seems like a huge issue. If you take a bacterial protein, a molecule literally designed to attack human tissue, and inject it directly into a patient's bloodstream as a medicine, you were going to trigger a massive immune response.
Oh, absolutely. That became the critical limiting factor. It's known as the antigenicity problem.
Because our bodies recognize it as the enemy.
Right. Because streptokinase is derived from streptococcus, and most humans have been exposed to strep bacteria at some point in their lives, our immune systems instantly recognize it as a foreign threat.
So they attack it.
Massively. When you give a patient streptokinase, their body rapidly builds a massive army of neutralizing antibodies against it.
So if a patient has a heart attack today and you save their life with streptokinase, you can't use it again if they have another heart attack a few months later.
Generally, no. If you attempt to re-administer it within, say, 6 months to a year, the patient's circulating antibodies will likely neutralize the drug before it can even reach the clot.
That's a huge problem.
And worse, introducing a recognized bacterial protein carries a real risk of triggering severe allergic reactions, and in rare cases, full-blown anaphylaxis.
So if a patient's own immune system neutralizes streptokinase after one use, doctors were left with this massive problem. Because heart attacks happen more than once, they desperately needed a molecule the human body wouldn't recognize as a threat.
They needed a stealthier approach, and that need initiated a global scientific race in the late 1970s and early 1980s.
To find a human version.
Exactly. The breakthrough came from a Belgian cardiologist and biochemist named Desiree Collin. He actually managed to isolate and characterize a naturally occurring human enzyme known as tissue plasminogen activator, or TPA.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because TPA isn't just some synthetic compound cooked up in a lab. It is a biological safety valve that your own blood vessels are manufacturing right now.
That's the amazing part. The endothelial cells that line the interior of your blood vessels, they secrete a slow, continuous background drip of TPA all the time.
Just to keep things flowing.
Yeah, its physiological role is to prevent microscopic unwanted clots from growing and causing problems. And Colin's crucial discovery was that TPA possesses something streptokinase lacks. It has fibrin specificity.
Meaning it doesn't just activate plasminogen everywhere in the bloodstream. It only becomes highly active when it physically binds to the fibrin at the site of an actual clot.
Right. In theory, this meant TPA could be administered to a patient, and it would travel quietly through the circulatory system, only detonating when it encountered the specific fibrin mesh of the blockage.
Like a smart bomb.
Exactly. But the massive hurdle was supply. You cannot harvest enough natural TPA from human tissue to treat millions of heart attack patients.
Which required a leap into genetic engineering. Because in 1983, looking at the texts, a team led by Diane Pennica at the biotech company Genentech successfully cloned the human TPA gene.
A huge milestone.
Yeah, it allowed them to mass-produce the human enzyme using recombinant DNA technology. And the resulting drug, alteplase or recombinant TPA, received FDA approval in 1987.
And the introduction of recombinant TPA just fundamentally changed the landscape. You suddenly had a pure human enzyme that circumvented the allergic reactions of streptokinase, and it promised this targeted fibrin-specific clot dissolution.
But reading through the clinical data in the sources, that promise of perfect targeting was put to the test. And the reality was a lot messier. Because if TPA is a native human protein, and it is supposedly specific only to fibrin, why isn't it perfectly safe?
Well, the danger lies in the concept of selectivity and what happens when you completely overwhelm the body's natural baseline.
The dosage.
Right. Streptokinase is inherently nonspecific. It activates plasminogen systemically, putting the patient's entire blood supply into a lytic state for hours, meaning their blood cannot clot anywhere.
Which sounds incredibly dangerous.
It is. Now, recombinant TPA is fibrin-specific, but only at low physiological doses. When emergency doctors administer the massive rapid dose required to blast through a blocked coronary artery, that specificity is overwhelmed.
So it wants to be targeted, but if you flood the system, it acts just like the bacterial version and starts dissolving clots everywhere anyway.
Pretty much. The clinical reality of this distinction was tested in 1993 with the GSTO-1 trial, and the sheer scale of this trial was unprecedented.
How big are we talking?
They enrolled over 41,000 heart attack patients for a direct head-to-head showdown. The older systemic bacterial streptokinase versus an accelerated regimen of the new targeted human TPA.
And looking at the results, the medical community made a massive pivot based on what looks like a razor-thin margin. The sources show TPA provided about a 1 percentage point absolute reduction in 30-day mortality.
That's correct.
It was roughly 6.3% mortality for TPA versus 7.3% for streptokinase. Wait, hold on. A 1% difference. You're telling me the medical community switched to a vastly more expensive engineered drug for a 1% absolute improvement?
I know, on an individual level, a 1% absolute difference seems incredibly marginal. But when you are dealing with cardiovascular disease, which is the leading cause of death globally, a 1% improvement applied to millions of patients translates to tens of thousands of lives saved worldwide every single year.
Okay, when you put it like that, it makes sense.
The clinical data backed up the switch for top-tier medical systems, but it ignited a fierce controversy over health economics.
Because that 1% came with heavy caveats. The texts explicitly note that TPA caused slightly more hemorrhagic strokes, which is bleeding in the brain, than streptokinase did, and it cost astronomically more.
Right, and the economic reality of that trial created a global equity divide that persists today. Wealthy healthcare systems absorbed the high cost of TPA to gain that fractional survival advantage and to avoid the allergic risks of streptokinase.
But what about everywhere else?
Well, in many developing nations and lower resource settings, the high cost of recombinant TPA makes it completely inaccessible. For a huge portion of the global population, the bacterial protein discovered in 1933 is still the primary life-saving option.
That's wild. But regardless of which drug is used, the GSDO-1 trial proved a terrifying pharmacological reality. Neither drug is perfectly safe. Because they both overwhelm the body's clotting system, they both carry the risk of hemorrhagic conversion.
And hemorrhagic conversion is the signature life-threatening danger of this entire class of drugs. To understand why it happens, we have to go back to the ischemic penumbra we discussed earlier.
The starving tissue.
Exactly. When an artery in the brain is blocked by a clot, the blood vessels downstream are starved of oxygen. As those vascular walls become ischemic, the tissue actually begins to break down and become fragile.
So when the thrombolytic drug finally dissolves the clot, you suddenly have this massive rush of high-pressure blood flowing back into pipes that had been structurally weakened.
Yes, and the weakened vessels rupture under the restored pressure. So an ischemic stroke, which is caused by a blockage, is suddenly converted into a hemorrhagic stroke caused by active bleeding directly into the brain tissue.
That is horrific.
The very mechanism used to save the starving tissue ends up destroying it.
If the risk of a fatal brain bleed is that high, how do emergency room doctors possibly manage that risk when a patient rolls through the doors?
They manage it by adhering to incredibly strict time protocols. This was a shift that was defined by a landmark 1995 trial testing IVTPA for acute strokes. The data revealed a brutal calculus.
Which is
the longer the brain tissue is deprived of oxygen, the more fragile the blood vessels become, and the higher the risk of catastrophic bleeding upon reperfusion.
This is the origin of the phrase time is brain, right?
Exactly. The trial demonstrated that if a carefully selected group of stroke patients received TPA within exactly 3 hours of their symptoms starting, they had a roughly 30% higher chance of recovering with minimal or no disability.
Even though the drug increased the risk of symptomatic brain bleeding tenfold. So the sources note the hemorrhage risk jumped from 0.6% in the placebo group up to 6% in the TPA group.
It's a huge jump.
Doctors basically accepted a massive increase in bleeding risk because the benefit of salvaging that ischemic penumbra was so high, but only if they beat the clock.
Right, and that time window was later extended to 4.5 hours for a very specific subset of patients. But the core principle remains absolute: the strict time limits and this massive checklist of exclusion criteria.
Like a recent surgery, right?
Yeah, a recent surgery, a history of internal bleeding, or even severely elevated blood pressure. Those are the only safety nets doctors have. Administer the drug too late, when the vessels are already too damaged, and you virtually guarantee a hemorrhage.
Which introduces one of the most stressful scenarios in emergency medicine, I would think. Because if the bleeding risks are catastrophic when given to the wrong person, what happens when a patient arrives in the ER exhibiting all the signs of a stroke, but they don't actually have a clot?
Emergency departments are constantly battling this. It's the phenomenon of stroke mimics.
The sources outline scenarios that sound identical to a stroke. A patient might arrive unable to speak, with one side of their body paralyzed. But the underlying cause might be TOS paralysis, which is like a temporary neurological condition that can follow a seizure.
Right.
Or it could be a severe complicated migraine with aura. Even extreme hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, can manifest as focal neurological deficits.
It's true. And when a patient presents with these symptoms, the ER operates under immense pressure. That 4.5-hour clock is ticking loudly.
How do they know for sure then?
Well, the primary diagnostic tool is typically a non-contrast CT scan of the brain. But in the very early hours of an ischemic stroke, a standard CT scan is primarily used to rule out an existing brain bleed. It does not always definitively show the clot itself.
Wait, really? So the doctors are essentially forced to make a high-stakes clinical judgment on the spot. They have to decide whether to administer a biochemical explosive that causes bleeding based on a scan that only tells them the patient isn't already bleeding.
That's the reality of it. And registry data indicates that a meaningful percentage of patients treated with TPA under emergency stroke protocols are eventually diagnosed with stroke mimics.
So they got the drug for nothing.
Yeah, they are exposed to the systemic risk of hemorrhagic conversion for absolutely zero therapeutic benefit, simply because the timeline demands immediate action before a more detailed MRI can be performed.
So if the chemical approach has this absolute safety ceiling and the risk of bleeding is unavoidable, the medical field had to find a way to bypass pharmacology altogether.
They did, which led to a massive paradigm shift in how we treat the most severe blockages. Around 2015, a wave of new clinical data hit the medical community and completely changed the rulebook.
What did it show?
Multiple studies definitively proved that for large vessel occlusions, the biggest, most dangerous clots in the main arteries of the brain, physics actually beats chemistry.
Because they moved to mechanical thrombectomy.
Exactly.
Instead of trying to dissolve the clot chemically, an interventional neuroradiologist physically threads a catheter up through the vascular system, deploys a specialized device like a stent retriever, grabs the clot, and literally yanks it out of the brain.
It's incredible to watch. Cardiology had actually already undergone a similar revolution years earlier with primary percutaneous coronary intervention, or PCI, where cardiologists use balloon angioplasty and stents to physically force the coronary arteries open.
Because by physically removing the blockage, you instantly restore reperfusion without putting the entire circulatory system into a tolytic state, completely sidestepping that massive systemic bleeding risk.
That's the huge advantage.
So does that mean thrombolytics have been replaced? Did the miracle drug of the 90s get demoted?
Well, they haven't been eliminated, but their clinical role has definitely been fundamentally redefined. In top-tier stroke centers today, intravenous TPA is frequently utilized as a bridge therapy.
A bridge to the surgery.
Right. If a patient arrives at a smaller regional hospital, they are given systemic TPA immediately to start degrading the clot. This buys precious time and protects the ischemic penumbra while the patient is physically transferred to a comprehensive stroke center capable of performing a mechanical thrombectomy.
Oh, it's like deploying a chemical crew to start softening up the mortar of the brick wall while you wait for the heavy physical machinery to arrive and pull the whole structure down.
Perfect analogy. Furthermore, the delivery method of the drugs themselves has evolved. Instead of flooding the entire body with an IV drip, interventionalists can now use catheter-directed thrombolysis.
Which means
They thread a microcatheter directly to the face of the clot and drip a tiny, concentrated dose of the drug right onto the fibrin mesh, significantly lowering the systemic risk.
that makes so much sense. So if we look at everything we've covered, from bacterial virulence factors melting immune defenses to the massive clinical gambles of the 90s and the modern shift to physical extraction, what does this all mean for the listener?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the evolution of thrombolytics maps the boundaries of human pharmacology. We learn to isolate and mass-produce the body's most potent hemostatic enzymes, but we also learn the hard limits of trying to control those biological systems with sheer chemical volume.
And it directly dictates how the world around you operates. I mean, this conference history is the reason emergency dispatchers prioritize stroke calls. It's why paramedics begin assessing your neurological baseline in the back of the ambulance, and why hospitals track their door-to-needle times down to the minute.
Absolutely.
Because when a clot blocks a major vessel, the downstream tissue is suffocating, and the window to salvage it is agonizingly short.
Time is brain and time is muscle. And for millions of people in areas without immediate access to advanced catheterization labs, these drugs, whether it is the engineered TPA or the original bacterial streptokinase, remain the definitive frontline defense against permanent disability or death.
We have covered the mechanisms, the historical debates, and the terrifying realities of stroke mimics in the ER today. But I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something that builds on the fundamental biology from today's sources.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, we learned that the endothelial cells lining your blood vessels are constantly secreting a slow drip of natural TPA to dissolve microscopic clots before they become a threat. It is your body's native, always-on safety valve. Which leaves a fascinating question for you to explore on your own. If your blood vessels are always producing this natural clot buster, what exactly is the biological trigger that causes the body to suddenly fail to make enough of it when a massive, life-threatening clot begins to form? The biological machinery to save your life is already there, so how exactly does that cellular SOS system break down just when you need it the most?
That is the ultimate mystery of the hemostatic balance.
Until next time, keep digging.